This time around, I'm going to be talking about first, Guy Ritchie's recent Arthurian movie, then second, about the Arthurian legend, and then wrap it up with the history of the Arthurian world. Now, and I'll see if I can remember to do chapter times in this video description. So to start it off with, just sharing my thoughts about the King Arthur movie by Guy Ritchie. It is King Arthur Legend of the Sword. And I'm going to just give you a few thoughts and only give one slight spoiler, thought, as it were. Now, it was as close to the Arthurian Legend as the BBC Merlin series, as in, it had a few elements, it had a few names, but it didn't have the full Arthurian story on screen. It was, it was its own thing. Excuse me, my camera's kind of falling there. Anyways, it was its own thing, just as this series was. Secondly, it had a lot of typical Guy Ritchie elements. A gritty hero in a grimy world, dealing with big situations, and there's one element which I'll get to in a minute. But, typical things that you see in most of his movies. I really liked his Sherlock Holmes movies, both of them. Man from U.N.C.L.E. was okay. Was a good visual story. I think the problem there is that is a movie based off a TV show. The Arthurian movie, as a movie, I thought it was good, and Guy Ritchie did well. Hunnam, he's a good actor. I liked him in Pacific Rim, and I've started watching Sons of Anarchy, and I like him there. He's a better Arthur than Clive Owen was. Let me say that. Jude Law, I thought, since he's a seasoned actor, has a lot more acting under his belt, movies and such, he was an effective villain, and at times could also be very tragic. Now, as with the, BBC Merlin series, there was a sort of Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings-esque feeling about this Arthurian movie, and getting much more into the fantasy adventure world than maybe the Arthurian world would be, originally. After all, it was originally knights, in armor, and only occasionally dealing with magical elements. Then. Let me get to the other Guy Ritchie element that I mentioned before, because it's its own topic. Montages, which is a staple of his. For something like Sherlock Holmes, it's where, he's telling a story while we see montages of what's going on. And, one effective one was in the first Sherlock Holmes is how he knew where he was being transferred, even though, a hood was placed over him. We kind of have that here. And, especially one early on, how did I start my day? Well, I went here and here and here, and we see him going through this day, here, here, and here. But there's one instance where the montage is showing us this journey that took place that he's going on. It's all montage of him on this journey. And that I kind of felt was a weak kind of usage for montage, because when a character goes on a journey, we need to see the steps of that journey, or else we don't feel that they've come. We don't feel where they've come to at the end of this journey. We don't feel that they've achieved. We don't understand their achievement at the end of this. So there with the specific journey montage, it was not as effective as it could have been. Now, there were anachronisms, and that's nothing new in the Arthurian world, and I'll get to that. Even before T.H. White, there's been anachronisms. Um, but I did like that there were old Roman buildings, huddled against wooden buildings in Londinium. Now, with the multiculturalism, this is really not anything new in the Arthurian world. In Wolfram's German romance, Percival's half brother is a mulatto, his mother being a queen of the Moors. And in the Middle Dutch romance, Sumerian, Sir Aglovale, who is supposed to be the brother of Percival, Aglovale has a son who is a Moor also, and in this romance, people act scared of him because of his dark skin color, and it's sort of a negative thing, but it's still, Moorian is a competent figure and a good one. And also there's Palmais, who's a Saracen who, at that time period in Middle Ages was a person of different color and different, religious belief. Now, of course, in the 5th and 6th century, not necessarily, there would not have been Moors or Saracens, but people of that were ancestors to these people. Certainly it's true during Roman London times, there would have been people of other races and cultures. And it's not, for the sake of story, you could say, well, some of these people stayed around, even though the culture was collapsing, they weren't able to leave. For the sake of story, you could say that, some of these people of different cultures stayed around. Now, again, as a movie, I enjoyed it. I thought it was a good fantasy movie. Not as straight up adaptation of the Arthurian Legend. All the movies out that have been of the Arthurian story, they touch upon it, but they don't get close. I feel that Excalibur will always be the ultimate Arthurian movie, even if it does not entirely, even if plays with things and doesn't get things entirely true to the legend, but it's the closest that we're going to get, I feel. As a movie, I enjoyed the King Arthur movie. It wasn't great, but it was good. Now for my spoiler-ish, comment. 1, 2, 3, spoiler. It was very much a live-action Lion King movie. What do I mean by that? In this movie, Jude Law plays Worgen, who is the uncle who kills his brother Uther, and Arthur is the cast-off who is raised by prostitutes. Well, this is very much the same concept that we see in Lion King, which, of course, in itself is pulling from the displaced, prince legend to begin with. A prince that's, cast off, he's raised by pirates, doesn't know who he is, and has to reclaim his heritage, his birthright. So for the Arthur movie, Scar and Vortigern are the same. Mufasa and Uther are the same. And, Mowgli and Arthur are the same, and so on, So it's very much a live-action Lion King movie. Now, just a couple of mentions, things I forgot to mention. First off, Guy Ritchie has cameos, and he uses them quite well. For example, we have David Beckham in a very short moment, and Ritchie uses him very well. You would know right off the bat this is David Beckham. And also, excuse me, there's Annabelle Wells, and I might be saying her name wrong, who was in the second season of Tudors as Jane Seymour. She appears in this movie, and since I brought up BBC Merlin, Katie McGrath, who plays Morgana in the BBC Merlin series. She plays Vortigern's wife in this King Arthur movie, which I thought was a very good, cameo appearance. And like I said, Ritchie uses these cameos very effectively. Now, one actress, and I'm going to try to say her name as best as I can, Astrid Burgess Frisbee. She plays a sorceress, and she's only referred to as the mage. That's it. We have no idea who her character is. I mean, is she Nimue? Is she Guinevere? What? We're not told. I mean, are we banking on there being a sequel and we're told later? Who knows? Anyways, that's my thought about this movie. It was enjoyable as a movie. Was it close to the Arthurian movie? Well, a lot of Arthurian movies aren't, I enjoyed it as a movie. I expected it to be close. I don't think it deserves the negative reviews, just kidding. But anyways, let's move on to the Arthurian myth, because it's a story that's a legend that's very interesting to me. It's where I get my screen name from, although that may not make sense to some people. It started off as, Welsh legends, and these were told by word of mouth, told verbally, oral tradition, and they were only written down much later on. And these are, told by the Welsh, i.e. the original Britons, and they're telling stories of Arthur and other characters, and they're more of telling stories of heroes and trying to remember the glory days when they ruled the island. Because, again, they're being pushed back by the Anglo-Saxons. Now, later, Nennius and Geoffrey of Monmouth are telling of Arthur's battles and victories, and how Arthur is fighting the Anglo-Saxons. And Geoffrey was, writing about the time of King Stephen, or thereabouts. And, Geoffrey is the one who created the character of Merlin. And, he's taking the character from Welsh characters, He's taking the character of Ambrose, who, prophesies to Vortigern at the time. He's taking the character of Merthin, although it's spelled with a double D, it's Merthin. And Merthin was a madman and a prophet. So Geoffrey creates the character of Merlin. So we get the start of the Merlin we know, the prophet, and, a madman and whatnot. Geoffrey creates this character. Now, so Geoffrey also creates this so-called history, and Arthur is the apex, fighting the Saxons and whatnot, and carving out an empire. And in Geoffrey, at this time, there's no Lancelot. While Arthur is fighting the Romans, he finds out that his nephew Mordred has taken over the kingdom and married Guinevere. Arthur goes back and fights him, gets wounded, and is taken off to the island of Avalon. And this is the first time we get the island of Avalon myth. Early Welsh, most of the tribes say, we don't want to think about a grave for Arthur. And so Geoffrey mentions Avalon, but it's a mythical no place, and Arthur's going to be healed there. Excuse me. I'm probably going to get notifications from my computer here. So we get a sort of mythical history here that Geoffrey is setting up. Now, as time goes on, the land is being overrun by the people that Arthur is supposed to have fought. And Britain is no longer Britain. It becomes Anglo land, i.e. England. because it's now but controlled by the Anglo-Saxons. And, eventually the Normans come in, and then the Plantagenets come in. So, the British, Britain becomes England, the culture changes, the language changes, English, and with the Normans and the Plantagenets speaking French, and we get Henry II, who wants the author, Wace, to translate Geoffrey into, Wace came first, who wants Wace to translate Geoffrey Monmouth into French. So Wace does this, and Wace is the first to mention the Round Table. And for Wace, the Round Table is a cultural thing, where it seats various people of other cultures. A Pict sits at the Round Table. And this is a very political thing. And it's to aid the Plantagenets to have unity for different people, i.e. the Welsh, the Saxons, the Normans, etc., etc. And, Wace dedicates the book to Eleanor of Aquitaine. The layman came after Wace, and he, further, retells the story, and it becomes more popular to the French-speaking audience. And, so the legend grows in the French courts, and, especially in the courts of love, which, Eleanor of Aquitaine helps found. And we get, I don't have the book on me to show, but we get Chrétien de Troyes. And he is the father of Arthurian romances. So we get the Arthurian romance tradition here, and some of these are stories of illicit love affairs, because Chrétien creates the character of Lancelot, who is in love with the queen. And here we get the story of how Lancelot is saving Guinevere from being abducted. She's carried off by Melgant. Lancelot goes out to save her. And so we get, because in this society we understand that love isn't necessarily by marriage, And again, it's to do with the courts of love. So it's medieval feminism, as it were. That the woman's power is, the knight is doing everything for her to win her love, to win her affection, and it's through her that she can either make or break the knight, and, it's through her that, he wins acclaim and fame. Now, Chrétien is also to tell of the Grail story and his unfinished Sir Percival story. And because it's unfinished, other writers would take up the mantle to continue the Percival story. And we get various continuations. And various authors, like, Wolfram and various others who, we get the second or the third and so on continuation of the Percival story. And, we eventually get Robert de Boron, who also continues the Percival story. And, now Robert is writing about during the time of the Fourth Crusade. And he would add in new elements. Now, since this is an age and time period when the barons are coming into conflict with the king and the lord, Robert creates the Sword and the Stone myth. And the dogma here is that it's the divine right of kings, that the people pray after Uther's death. God, show us a clear sign of who Uther's heir is going to be. God sends down the sword and the stone. Arthur pulls the sword. He's the rightful king. He's ruling because he's God's messenger. He's ruling by divine right of kings. So that's where we get the origin of the Sword and the Stone story. And, we also get for the first time that the Grail is connected to the Christ story, i.e., Joseph of Arimathea catches the blood of Christ. Sorry, I have my Facebook up. Joseph of Arimathea catches the blood of Christ. He's taking the cup from the Last Supper, and it's being brought to England. He's setting up the first round table, and the foundation of Glastonbury Monastery. We get that legend and the origins of the Christian Grail story. With Chrétien, he just says that the Grail is a golden cup. The Grail being a cup in French courts that a rich lord would have. Anyways, for Chrétien, the cup is catching a wafer delivered by a dove, which is, keeping the wounded king alive. For Robert de Boron, it's clearly the cup of Christ. So we get the Grail, cup of Christ story here, and it will continue on. Throughout the ages, we get with further, Robert de Boron would influence the various French writers and so on with his versions. We get various ballads, and probably the most famous ballads would be Gawain and Green Knight. Gawain would have various other ballads, but this is probably his most famous English, written language ballad here. And there would be various other ballads and stories. There would be various writers who would take the Tristan legend and connect it to the Arthurian legend. Originally was its own thing. So they would connect it to the Arthurian legend. And so, the legend continues for what is called the Vulgate cycle, which is, written in the midst of the Middle Ages. And here we get the focus on Lancelot, because again, these are, French-focused stories. They would be told in French or in prose. We get the focus on Lancelot, his early life, and his continuing adventures. We get the start of the Galahad legends and that Grail's version of how it's Galahad is the main focus and Lancelot is the main focus. We would get the prose version of the Tristan myth, which is going to be important to an upcoming writer. We also get a change in the downfall of Arthur, and how the legend comes to an end. Because again, Geoffrey, it's, he's off at the Roman War, and, comes back and, finds his kingdom taken over by Mordred. Now it's being brought to an end because the illicit love affair of, Guinevere and Lancelot. And this is being brought in from the influence of Tristan. And, because the Tristan story is a story of an illicit love affair bringing down a kingdom. So this influences the Arthurian legend in that, the illicit love affair of Guinevere and Lancelot is bringing down the kingdom and it destroys it, and Mordred is able to take over, and the tragedy, takes place. So again, the story is retold and, is changing. Then we get the most significant of Arthurian books, which is Le Morte d'Arthur by Thomas Malory. The single most important English written Arthurian work. He is taking elements of the various prose, such as the prose Tristan, stuff from the Vulgates, from, Death of Arthur and the stories of Lancelot, and the Quest of the Grail. He's taking these various legends, combining them together, leaving out some elements, and, making a unified story. And this is probably one of the attempts since Geoffrey to tell a unified Arthurian story and bringing all legends, sort of together. And he tells it in his own way. And he's very much, as each of these writers have been doing, he's telling it for the audience of his day. Because he's writing in the midst of the Wars of the Roses. A very heavy English Civil War. So to him, it's a story of knights who are trying to preserve the rule of the king. How barons are ruling by bad laws, and the knights are bringing them down and converting them. And, Gawain had already been, gone out of focus with the Vulgate stories, because it's focusing on Lancelot. Because again, he's a French knight, in French stories. And so he's already in the background, and he's fighting a family feud. Mallory, he is really down on Gawain. And that's because he's fighting a family feud. Because again, Mallory's living in a large family feud going on. So of course he brings Gawain down. Because Gawain is shedding blood of families and, causing massive conflicts and whatnot. Anyways, so that's, how the story changes for Mallory. He tells from the birth of Arthur until his death, with stories integrated of various knights. His Tristan version is very much the bulk of the story, although it's very interesting that Mallory tells the death of Tristan off stage. And it's the most significant Arthurian work written. All future versions of the story are very much heavily based off Mallory, and are either a retelling of Mallory or a rewriting of Mallory and whatnot. So if you want to read a medieval work of Arthur, I would say read Mallory and then also read Gawain the Green Knight, so you get some love for Gawain. If nothing else, read these two books, and maybe some Geoffrey. Now, in some ways, the end of the Middle Ages is when we get an end to, the Arthurian story. I mean, for one thing, Mallory is the apex of Arthurian literature. How can you go any higher than Mallory? And again, like I said, I find it significant that with the Renaissance coming up and the end of the Middle Ages, that the Arthurian story kind of dwindles. It pops up a few times with plays, and Dryden has a musical, and there's, various occasional stories off and on. Edmund Spenser would reference Arthur now and again. We would get, over time, eventually, Tennyson having his Idylls of the King, and we would get the most significant modern version, which is The Once and Future King by T.H. White. And this, of course, would inspire the Camelot musical and various, modern adaptations like the Disney, Sword in the Stone. And, we would get various modern versions, and things like Mist of Avalon has an element, which is not my favorite, of taking neo-paganism and New Age stuff and modern day spiritualism and trying to put it on the Celts, which is not really my favorite thing. I mean, I did enjoy this miniseries version of it. It condenses things very nicely and tells the story very well. And various modern versions do the same thing, but there are a few good ones out there. Some good authors out there telling the Arthurian story over the years. Some not so great, some decent ones. And in some ways, I feel the Arthurian legend in recent times has kind of gotten away from where it was. It's gotten away from its roots, and I feel in some ways it needs to get back to its roots. Anyways, that's my feelings about the legend itself. Now, just to briefly talk about the history itself. First off, Winston Churchill commented that when speaking of these legends, that it's all true, or it ought to be, and more and better besides. So the Arthurian legend and history is very much, if not something that did happen, but what sort of we wish did happen, or a wish fulfillment thing. It's like the Superman stories of the Golden Age being written during the Great Depression. That we wish that this Arthur character, this Superman character, was around during these times of great turmoil. And great characters of legend are born in this manner. I mean, during the time period, I spoke of anachronisms. I mean, the medieval stories are knights in shining armor with medieval castles. Well, in the 5th and 6th story, the knights would be the sort of British Roman cavalrymen who would have iron, chainmail, I should say, and not your typical knight in shining armor as we would think of it. And a castle would not be the medieval castle. In fact, castle comes from the Roman term castellum, which is a term for what we call our forts. For the Welsh, it's castle with a double L. English is just simple castle. So this would be the castle of the 5th and 6th century, i.e., a protected fort area. No stone buildings, but very, probably a stone perimeter, but mainly wooden buildings in a centralized area, usually hill forts and, such type buildings, but not a castle in terms of the medieval sense. And, we're living in the 5th and 6th century. We're living in a time when the British, they're on their own. The Romans have abandoned them because the Roman Empire is collapsing. They're dealing with their own problems. They can't be bothered with the outposts. Gaul is collapsed, and Gaul is where the Roman money was made. And when Gaul fell first, the Roman, in Britain would rebel instead of their own emperors, like Maximus. And eventually Rome just abandons Britain. We have our own problems to deal with. We have an empire that's falling apart. We can't be bothered with you anymore. So Britons are on their own. They have, for the north, the Pictish, what's referred to as the Pictish tribes coming downwards. We have the Irish incursions. The Irish are coming in to what is called Cornwall, and would become called Wales, and the Irish would go into the north. And, we would have the birth of the Scottish tribes. And then we have the Anglo-Saxons coming in, and they're pushing in territory, and they're, dominating much of the western, not western, but half of the country, and they're taking in much of the land, and British they're being pushed further back. They're being called the Welsh because Welsh comes from a Saxon term, strangers, and so the British are being pushed back here. Now, was it a real Arthur? We can't really say. Maybe there was a figure that a warlord who helped the Britons fight the Saxons. The difficulty is in trying to prove this, and unfortunately, most try to use the legend to prove things. But as I've just demonstrated, the legend was told much later. For example, the sword and the stone thing. Some say, well, that comes from Sarmatian things because the Sarmatians were written. Well, as I pointed out, Robert de Boron was running during the Fourth Crusade. What did he know of the Sarmatians? What did Geoffrey Monmouth, who, by the way, is telling the story of Arthur burning Tintagel? Yes, there's a Tintagel in the 5th, 6th century, but Geoffrey is telling this story because one of his patrons was either born in Tintagel or was ruling there or whatnot. So, and again, like I said, Avalon in Geoffrey is a mythical no place. It becomes linked to Glastonbury because of medieval propaganda. Because we have Henry II, who's dealing with Welsh rebels. So how do we put this down? Well, we say that their hero is dead. And a Welsh bard supposedly tells them the location of Arthur's death. And Glastonbury says, well, here he is. We found him. We dug him up. Yes, they did dig someone else up, but we have not really much proof of that. And, sorry about that. And, then we have Richard the Lionheart, whose legend, some people say he has Excalibur, although I don't feel he deserves it, because he's a murderer. And he's, waging crusades, so the monks, they continue the story, they dig up a grave, they say they have Arthur, and this is to, again, it's for political reasons, to prove that a Welsh hero is dead, so that the Welsh rebels don't have a hero. It's so that the church can gain notoriety and gain popularity, if not money, because part of their chapel had just recently burned. So I don't believe that Glastonbury is Avalon. I truly do not. And I believe it is political propaganda. Now, Cadbury is linked to Camelot. Well, that comes from Leland, and I'd be very interested to know where Leland is getting his sources from, because he never entirely tells us. And it's interesting, that he would reference to it. But I'll get to that in a second, because yes, Cadbury was around during that time of Arthur, but I don't see any real proof that anyone named Arthur was there at the time. Now, Edward III had at Winchester round table tournaments, what is called round table tournaments, and he would play the role of Arthur. And, so Winchester became closely linked with Camelot in the medieval mind. In fact, to Mallory, Camelot and Winchester are very much linked together, which is why Henry VII, Henry Tudor, wants his firstborn son, named Arthur, born at Winchester Castle, not only for the Arthurian reference, but to solidify his link to Edward III. And Richard the VIII, Henry Tudor's son, would also have round table ballads with himself as, King Arthur. So it's interesting that Leland, during a time of Henry VIII, is saying that Cadbury is Camelot when we've had this Winchester link here. And where, Leland is getting his sources, we don't know. So, I mean, there's just so much about Dark Ages Britain, and I've done a lot of studying of the time period, that we don't know. And it's called Dark Ages for a reason here. There's some things we know, and some things are a lot of guesswork, and, some things are, we've dug up and found, but there's just a lot limited physical element. Again, Tintagel. Okay, yes, there was Tintagel at the time, but that reference comes from Geoffrey. Canterbury, yes, there was a castle there, or fort there at the time, but what connection do we have? Anything saying Arthur lived there? None. Glastonbury, again, I believe that's political propaganda. So we just don't have a lot of physical element to say, yes, here's an Arthur. I'm sorry, guys, for all the interruptions here. Anyways, there's just a lack of physical evidence to say, yes, here's an Arthur. Here he is. He ruled such and such time, and so on. But because all we have in the end is the legend. Believe me, as an Arthurianist, a self-scholar of the Arthurian story, I would love it if Arthur was a real person, but we just have so few evidence. Is it possible? Sure. I refer back to Winston Churchill's comment about this, that it's all true, or it ought to be. This is a sort of, and this is where it's coming from, a wish from the film, because it's Britain being overrun by their enemy. So, of course, we want to have someone that's beating him on the front. And indeed, for a time, the Britons are holding back the seconds for a time. They're not, although, during the time, Cynric in Wessex is the most prominent of, is Saxon, lords who's making, headway. So maybe there could have been Arthur. There's just not a lot of evidence. Anyways, so that's my thoughts about the movie, and that's my thoughts about the Arthurian legend and the history of the legend. Hopefully you enjoyed this, and it's been informative to you, and so on. So take care, guys, and see you guys later.